Welcome to the special lecture on Spinoza. Let's see how this works out. Hopefully Hav will be back soon. We'll be able to hold the camera in such a way that it's pointing at me or the blackboard. But until then, you might or might not see anything. So the basic theme of today's reading was how God causes the world to exist. And of course, according to Spinoza, there's a simple answer to how God causes the world to exist, namely, God is the world. And in a way, everything Spinoza says about this is just that over again. Like in a way, he actually doesn't add anything to that. But of course, it turns out to be more complicated. And again, it's partly complicated because there is sort of a plot to it, again, as in the meditations, that there's a certain way we think things might be. And he starts talking as if that were true, but then it turns out to be different than that.
Blah, 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 blah.
Okay, so the terms that Spinoza is using to talk about God causing the world to exist are natura naturans and natura naturata. So, I mean, this is an active participle and this is a passive participle. So this means like naturing nature versus natured nature. I mean, we already saw something about this in Descartes in the sixth meditation where he says that by nature I mean either God himself or the world as ordered by God. So, I mean, for Descartes, that's just a kind of double use of the word nature. But for Spinoza, he really is talking about the exact same thing. Right? God is nature. So this is a convenient way for him to talk because he's trying to remind you that he's talking about the exact same thing seen from two different points of view. And what are the two different points of view? And basically, this is the infinite divine essence. And then this is going to have to be somehow finite things, except there aren't any things other than God. So what are finite things then? Yeah.
Wait, so natura naturata is like nature having been nature?
Yeah, it's as if to nature were a verb.
Okay.
Right.
So one is the having been created and one is the act of creating.
Right. But of course,
or being. Existing.
Yeah, but of course God doesn't create the world because God is the world, right?
Yeah.
So what this relationship is what is going to be hard to understand. Okay, so what are finite things? Well, we know they're not substances. So they're some kind of mode or affection of substances. Because those are the only two things by axiom 3 or whatever axiom that is. Axiom 1, actually. All things that are either in themselves or in something else. So the only kinds of things there are substances and their affections, but there's only only one substance, and everything else is a mode or affection of that substance. And that actually was pretty much the content of Proposition 15, the end of the reading for last time. Whatever is in God, and nothing can be conceived without God. Right? Given the definition of mode or affection, definition 5, that which is in something else and is conceived through something else, Proposition 15 says everything is a mode or affection of God. Now, I mean, this is hard to understand. And in fact, it's impossible to imagine. Right? That is, if I say, what is this chair? So the answer is that it's a mode or affection of God. And it's hard to understand and impossible to imagine because this chair doesn't seem to be a property of something the way a mode is supposed to be. Right? Like, remember what modes are in Descartes. Yeah.
But, I mean, in a way, it's the easiest thing to imagine and understand because a chair does not exist on its own. In the sense that it's impossible to conceive of just a chair.
With nothing else.
With absolutely nothing else.
Well, so, I mean, first of all, Descartes, of course, denies that.
But yeah, I guess
Right?
I deny his denial.
Yeah, well, so does Spinoza. But yeah, so Descartes and Aristotelians would deny that too, basically. Right? Because remember, Aristotle thought the whole universe was finite in space. And all or most Aristotelians think that means there isn't anything outside the universe, period. So there's even like a discussion about whether God could create by a miracle a little bubble on the outermost sphere. I mean, this is the kind of discussion that goes on in the later Middle Ages. People are interested in questions like this. So some people say it's impossible because there isn't even any space out there for the bubble to go into. Right. So, and Descartes too will say, look, you understand what extension is, you understand what finite extension is. So that means you can conceive of a piece of finite extension by itself. Now, I mean, Descartes would agree with Spinoza that you can't conceive of it without God. But that's going to turn out to actually be, when you get down to it, if you want to say, wait, do Spinoza and Descartes really just agree about this? And they're just using the words differently. So the fact that, according to Descartes, you can conceive of it without every other body shows that he doesn't agree with Spinoza. He doesn't mean the same thing as Spinoza, even though he does agree, strictly speaking, it isn't a substance because it requires God.
But you can't conceive of it without, through God, because the idea of chair is something that you've been acquainted with through your senses, whether or not you can trust sense, whatever.
Yeah, so, right, remember,
But,
according to Descartes, you're not acquainted through your senses.
Exactly. But you're acquainted through God.
Yeah, and the way you're acquainted
idea.
with it is that you have the idea of the infinite, and the idea of the infinite contains eminently in it infinite extension. And that's why you can think of finite extension. The same way you can think of finite thought, because you have the idea of the infinite. And so you can only think of a doubting, finite thinking thing because you already have the idea of the infinite. That was part of the third meditation proof, the way I explained it. So similarly, Descartes, although he doesn't go into this in the meditations because it's not necessary for the argument, but obviously Descartes similarly thinks that the idea of the infinite, that is the idea of God, is prior to the idea of finite extension for the same reason. So basically you understand that chair is a limitation of divine perfection, But that only makes sense because Descartes believes in immanent reality. And I already pointed out last time that Spinoza doesn't believe in that. So that's a way of seeing why they disagree about this. Right? Because according to Spinoza, you can't understand a chair simply as a finite limitation of the divine essence without putting the attribute of extension in between. And you can't understand the attribute of extension without understanding all the infinitely many bodies that it implies. Something like that. So, right, so getting back to it. I mean, yeah, you're right, I guess, in the sense that it's easier to agree with Spinoza about if Descartes says, look, you can conceive of a chair without anything else except God. You can't imagine that. That's true. Or at least it's hard to imagine that. I mean, Descartes could explain why you can't imagine that, right? Descartes says when you try to imagine it, you're trying to duplicate in the pineal gland the impression of a chair, right? The effect a chair would have on your senses if there were nothing else in the universe but a chair. And of course, if there were nothing else in the universe but a chair, it wouldn't have any effect on your senses. Right? So that's why you can't succeed. Descartes would agree you can't succeed in imagining that. But what I was going to say about Spinoza's point, on the other hand, is that it's hard to imagine this chair as a property of something else. Right? That is, you can think, yeah, sure, it has to be limited by other things, but it's hard to think of it as something like a shape of something else. Right? I mean, we know it has a shape, but now we're saying that it's like a shape of something else. There actually is, I'm told, I haven't even looked into this partly because it sounds dumb to me, but I'm told that somewhere in the Spinoza literature, in the secondary literature on Spinoza, there's a lot of disputes about whether finite modes should be seen as things or properties.
When you say things, do you mean substance things?
Well, what I'm about to say is this. Spinoza doesn't think there are things or properties in the way we ordinarily think there are, and that's why this question couldn't be answered in a satisfactory way. Right? So we think of a thing as something that can kind of be there by itself and then wait around to see what other things there are. And, when you say we can't imagine the chair without other stuff, I think Descartes could point out in support of his position, but we can imagine all the other stuff changing. But Spinoza is going to say we can imagine that, but we're deluding ourselves when we imagine that. It's really, everything is connected by absolute necessity.
Because there only is one thing.
Because there only is one thing. Right, well, no, there only is one substance. The substance has infinite modes, but all the modes follow necessarily from the essence of that one substance in a certain necessary order. So this chair, that is, or whatever's really here, couldn't have other bodies around it. You can't switch these bodies for other bodies.
Can you explain that? What did you say?
Well, I mean, I can't explain it more at this second, but I can explain more why it means that there aren't things in the way we think there are, right? I mean, that is what we think, again, what we think of as a thing, agreeing with Descartes, is something that can exist on its own without other things. And again, even if we admit, well, I can't really imagine just the chair existing by itself, we still think of it as something that can exist without other things in the sense that we can abstract from the particular other things that happen to be around it.
But even Descartes suggesting that we are a thinking thing, I mean, he's using that, or he must be using it in an equivocal sense, because the thinking thing cannot exist without God. Like, I feel like the argument of substance here is really just going back to the difference between univocal and equivocal.
Well, I mean, remember, Descartes said explicitly in the Principles that the term substance applies equivocally to God and finite substances.
Mm-hmm.
So he agrees with you about that. I mean, the question is what kind of unity of meaning he thinks there is, because he doesn't seem to think that it's absolute homonymity. Right? That it's, I mean, Spinoza actually alludes in today's reading to the traditional example of that. I used bank. But the traditional example of that is the term dog as applied to a dog versus the term dog applied to a certain star. The claim being that that star is not in any sense a dog, right? It's just the same sound, but they have nothing else in common. Of course, they have something else in common, but not something else in common only to them by virtue of which they only get that name, right? I mean, they're both bodies or whatever, but that's not relevant. So it doesn't seem like when Descartes says that the term substance applies equivocally to God and creatures that he means that it's that kind of absolute equivocality. He means that it's there's a strict primary sense and a secondary sense. God is a substance in the strict sense that he can be conceived without anything else, whereas finite substance it can be conceived without anything else except God. But the point is, Spinoza doesn't think that the chair is a finite substance in Descartes' sense either. It's not just that it can't be conceived without God, it can't be conceived without all the other bodies in the exact order they're in.
Is it the same thing as saying without God? Because
It
all
is
the other
the
bodies
same.
are God.
Right, it is the
Yeah.
same thing as saying without God, but it's a different way of saying it,
Yeah.
which according to Descartes is not a way of saying it at all, right?
Okay.
So there really is a disagreement here, right? If you said to Descartes, I can't conceive of this chair without all other bodies, which would mean according to him that it's not a finite substance either, he would say, number one, that's not true, and number two, that's completely different from saying you can't conceive of it without God.
Well, it's just a different definition of God, right? Or just he stands the...
Well, the definition is an absolutely infinite substance is the same.
What's the difference between eminence and literalness?
Yes.
What's the...
It's the difference between literally having infinite, absolutely infinite attributes and having them eminently. That's the difference.
What would it mean to have eminently infinite attributes? I get the...
Well, it means to have the infinite degree of reality from which any attribute that a substance could have could follow to any extent, right? Which, according to Descartes, God does have that, right? So God could create any body as big as you want, or any thinking thing as thinking as you want.
So, like, it's more like God has the potential for that, but in Spinoza's view, he is that.
Right. So again, there is a real difference here. I want to get back to talking about finite things though, because we have to. Right. So there is a real difference between Spinoza and Descartes, and again, Spinoza's point of view, although Descartes' point of view ultimately maybe is hard to imagine too, and that's a good point. Spinoza's point of view is also impossible to imagine. Right. That is, we can't imagine a chair in such a way that there couldn't be other things around the exact same chair, right? Like water instead of air, different particles of air than the ones that are there now, right? And similarly, when we think of a property, we think of something that could belong to many different things, right? So if we think of if we think of a thing, we think of something where it can exist by itself and you can change the other ones around it. And we think of a property like a color, we think, oh, something else could have the same color. But that's also not true of finite things according to Spinoza, right? There isn't something else that could have that property. There's only one thing that has properties. So that's why, according to Spinoza, so that's why you can't give a satisfactory answer to that question, according to Spinoza. And moreover, Spinoza can explain, I mean, we haven't seen what Spinoza thinks the imagination is yet, and that will help more with this explanation, but we already know that somehow the imagination is a faculty of like picturing things rather than actually knowing what they are. Right? So that is, remember in Descartes, the difference between a chiliagon as imagined versus a chiliagon as understood. So when you imagine a chiliagon, you have some kind of like vague picture of lines kind of coming together, and there's a lot of them, right? But that's no different from imagining a myriagon. When you understand a chiliagon, you couldn't possibly get it mixed up with a myriagon. They're completely different. So Spinoza is going to say that when we think of things and properties this way, we're really just imagining them, right? It's something like picturing colored shapes is what we're doing. And that whatever the nature of the imagination is, it doesn't contain true ideas of things. It contains these pictures instead. And based on these pictures, we convince ourselves that such things are possible. Whereas if we just use the understanding, the intellect, we would know that it's not possible. It's absurd.
That was absurd?
The idea of a finite thing that can exist no matter what other finite things there are, and the idea of a property of a finite thing that could just as well attach to another finite thing. Both of those things are absurd, but we think they make sense because we can imagine them, we can picture them.
So that means the equivalent of saying like, the orange color of an orange can only be in that orange?
The orange color of this orange can only be in that orange. If orange were a true property of things, which it isn't, right? But it is a way we imagine things. And sure enough, the ways we imagine things can be switched around that way. And that's why we think that true properties could be, but they can't. This is kind of the opposite of like getting ready to teach 100C next year. This is kind of the exact opposite of what Hume says about this. Right? Hume says that the only idea we have at all of extension is of colored shapes, vaguely filling space, and that when we think we're doing something more precise, we're deluding ourselves. Yeah.
Would Spinoza think that, or say that finite things only exist in the human mind or in our imagination? In our perception of it?
Finite things exist, but they're not the way we imagine them to be.
Aren't they truly infinite? The substance is infinite?
The substance is infinite, but the modes, some are and some are not.
Okay.
Right? So, I mean, and look, he has to admit that there are finite modes. He has to admit that there are finite things in some sense. Why? Well, it's the same reason that way Descartes can prove it. Right? I mean, it's the problem of evil, basically. If I could be wrong about something, then obviously a finite thing exists. So, if I'm even trying to convince myself of something and I'm not sure, it's already obvious that a finite thing exists. Spinoza doesn't go through that argument, but he could if he needed to, right? Or to put it differently, he wouldn't even bother to deny that. So he does say somewhere, like in the second proof of Proposition 14, the existence of God, he does say, but we exist, and so Right, but it's, if finite things, basically if finite things exist, God must exist, but we exist, so. And he says he doesn't have to go that route, but he can go that route, and he doesn't say why, that is, just as he doesn't say where the other axioms come from. Why is it an axiom that finite things exist? But I'm telling you why it's not open to him to deny that, right? So, but in this whole way of thinking, at least, the position that there's only an infinite thing and there's no finite things in any sense is not open. I guess in a sense you could say that Hegel thinks that, but in a sense. But anyway, we're not talking about Hegel. All right. So, wow. Well, I spent more time on that than I wanted to, but it was probably a good time spent, except I wonder if there's other things we won't get to. Anyway, yeah, so I wanted to say one other thing about this, which has to do with the reading for last week, actually, which is connected to this, namely the idea of whether infinite extension is divisible. Right? So remember, Spinoza answers these objections. When he first says that extension is an attribute of God, he has to answer these objections, which say, well, no, extension isn't suitable to be an attribute of an infinite substance because everything extended is divisible. And Spinoza, first of all, basically says, well, look, I just proved that extension is an attribute of God, and I just proved that no substance is divisible, so therefore you must have made a mistake. That's his first answer, right? And he thinks that's sufficient, right? I mean, clearly, I've just proved that extension is not divisible. But we still have to understand, like, again, why do we even think that infinite extension would be divisible? And I think, again, it's because when we try to imagine infinite extension, we imagine it as just like this blackboard, only much bigger. So it has room for lots and lots of colored shapes on it. Whereas what infinite extension really means to the understanding is just extension with no other determination. Right? It just means extension not yet limited in any way. And that's not divisible. It doesn't have parts. It's not even the kind of thing that could have parts. And if that's right, that gives a clue as to how these infinite divine attributes should be understood. Like what infinity means in this context. It doesn't mean bigness. It just means not yet being definite.
Wait, can you repeat the part on infinite substance when we understand it is understanding it without other things affecting it?
When we understand, I mean, so there's something weird about this, which I'm going to get to in a second. But so far, all I said was this: when the understanding has infinite extension as its object, what are you thinking of? So all you're thinking of is extension. Period. Right? The absolute nature of extension. That just means extension without adding any other termination to it. What's weird about that is the idea that something follows from that. That somehow all the finite determinations of extension follow from that. Right? That's where the bigness or the power of this infinity comes from. Otherwise, it would just be mere abstraction. It would just be empty. So the thing that's weird here is the thought that, and this in a way is what replaces eminent being, or eminent reality, right? Is the idea that from a universal, all the particulars falling under it somehow follow. So, I mean, and that, going back to this issue, is a more detailed answer to how it is that God causes the world to exist. right? The divine essence is, so to speak, the universal concept of everything. But it's not a kind of empty universal, where you're just abstracting from all the details. It's the universal power, not yet differentiated, from which everything is going to follow. So I was gonna say something in more detail about the traditional pictures that Spinoza is working against here, or with. I'm not sure, given how slow we were getting started and everything, that I don't know. I guess I'll just try to say very quickly that so the idea that there's, number one, a divine essence, which is in itself not differentiated, but from which everything follows, and that there's, number two, divine attributes, which somehow are still infinite, but somehow specify that. So let's say, here's one level, divine essence. And then here's the next level, attributes. And then under that, there's kind of eternal finite things. Like angels, right? Separate intellects, or the celestial spheres. And then under that, then there's sublunar finite things, corruptible things. Things that sometimes exist and sometimes don't. That says corruptible. It's in parentheses.
What would be an example of that?
Well, so like Bucephalus is supposed to, this is the traditional picture I'm talking about, right? Right? So like Bucephalus is an example of a sublunar finite thing. Sometimes there's Bucephalus and sometimes there isn't. There was a time before there was Bucephalus, and then there was Bucephalus, and then there was no Bucephalus. Right? As opposed to like the celestial spheres or the angels, which, although they're specific, in the case of the celestial spheres, that's clear how that's true, right? I mean, they're literally finite. They only take up some of space. And they're rolling in a certain position at a certain time. They don't have all their positions at once. Nevertheless, they always exist. So, I mean, obviously, you can make more distinctions within each of these, but I'm not going to bother to do that. So the point is, so this is a pretty traditional picture. Now, I mean, there's a lot of controversies about the details. One controversy is about divine attributes, whether there are any divine attributes. Right? So like the real purists, monotheists, and probably Maimonides is the most radical, will say, no, there are no positive attributes whatsoever in God, in any sense. So any positive predication of God whatsoever is misleading. So there's negative predications that can be made about God that are literally true, but the positive ones, none of them are literally true.
What do you mean by that? Positive versus negative?
Well, so if you say God is not a chair, then that's literally true.
So you can't say anything for sure about God, but you can say what God isn't?
No, it's not positive. It's not positive. It's positive as opposed to negative. It's not positive as opposed to like, oh, maybe. Right? So in other words, you can't say God is, well, you can, but you have to realize that it's not literally right? So if you say God is powerful, or God exists even, according to Maimonides, it's not literally true. Exist doesn't have the same meaning that it has with us. And it's a use of God, it's not a predicate. There is no distinction of subject and predicate in God. Okay, like I said, that's an extreme position. Most people try to find some room for this one way or the other, right? I mean, either in terms of the Trinity, or Neoplatonists have some way of doing this, or, I mean, and Kabbalists and the Jewish tradition have some way of doing this. Gnostics, right? There's like, Maimonides is unusual in saying, no, I'm not going to let anything be there. But the other controversies mostly have to do about like the connection here, and in particular, whether there's divine freedom or not. So, could God have made the world different than it is? And if so, why did God make it the way it is and not some other way?
When Spinoza would say he couldn't have, right?
Spinoza would say he couldn't have. And he's not the only one who would say that. Right? So many ancient Neoplatonists would say that the world the way it is absolutely, well, at least as far as this stuff goes, that it's absolutely necessary. And that whatever is not absolutely necessary down here, that's an imperfection, right? I mean, that's not something that's due to the will of the one beyond being. It doesn't have a will. Everything necessarily flows out of it. And I mean, that's a pretty common position later too, but there's also a position, and interestingly, Maimonides now is on this side of the question. There's a position that says, no, everything in the world is there for a purpose. It's better because it's this way rather than some other way. And that's due to the divine will. Now, obviously, if Maimonides, based on what I said before, if Maimonides says that's due to the divine will, it really doesn't mean anything we can understand by that, beyond that everything in the world has a purpose. Right? That there's natural teleology, that is, that you can look for the final causes of things. Remember that issue in Descartes, and Spinoza brings it up too. That why do people think that they can look for final causes, purposes for everything in the world? And there's also, so I guess, right, so there's these three views: necessity, divine will with a purpose, and indifferent divine will. Right? That is, yes, God could have made the world some other way. Is there a reason why he made it this way? No, this is just the way he decided to make it. Descartes seems to be saying that in that Objections and Replies passage. Right? That the divine will is absolutely indifferent. And that what's good and what's bad follows from the divine will rather than the other way around. Now, I mean, I think there's some question about exactly what Descartes means by that. But that's the way Spinoza understands that position. So,
what's the difference between number one and number two?
Necessity and purpose?
Mm-hmm.
Well, so, I mean, this says that God could not have made anything different than he did. This says, I mean, Spinoza is going to say that this distinction makes no sense, right? But nevertheless, it sounds like it makes sense. This says God could have made things differently, but he didn't because this way is better.
Mm.
And this says God could have made things differently, but there's no reason they're this way rather than some other way. Right? The indifference of the divine will is absolute. Nothing can precede it. So Spinoza actually says this is better than this, but they're both wrong.
3 is better than 2.
Right. Spinoza says 3 makes more sense than 2. 2 makes it sound like there's some standard outside of God that God could consult to decide what's better and what isn't. That makes no sense at all, says Spinoza. But 3 is wrong too. 1 is right. Okay, I could have talked about prophecy here, but I guess I'll talk about that later. is it? I guess it's time to take a break. Should we take a break, even though we started late? Or should we not take a break? No break? No break. Okay, no break. I'll just go on. All right. So on this controversy, Spinoza obviously takes that side. Everything is absolutely necessary. Right? And he says, and I mean, again, this is like, it's not clear which is the religious side of this dispute and which is the anti-religious side. It depends which religion you're talking about and which people you're asking. Jews and to some extent Christians tend to look at the religious side as being A, divine freedom, and B, human freedom. There's more of a sense in Christianity that predestination is a doctrine that has to be maintained. In Islam, it at some point became seen as the orthodox point of view that there is no human freedom, that everything is fated by God. I guess you could, like, both of these are things that you could see religious uses for. I guess is one way of putting it. Spinoza is definitely rejecting Maimonides in saying this, but it's less clear in Christian terms even whether he's being heretical in saying that. Yeah.
Well, isn't the idea of predetermination, doesn't that fit in perfectly with necessity?
Well, yes and no. I mean, so the predestination fits in well with saying there's no human freedom, although that's not what most Christians want to say, because they want to say that there's blame. So, right. But yeah, so predestination fits in well with saying there's no human freedom. On the other hand, predestination is supposed to mean grace. So it doesn't fit in so well with saying there's no divine freedom, like God had to give the elect whatever he gave them. Right? That's not what you're supposed to say. Yeah, anyway, that's as much as I want to say about that. On this, obviously, Spinoza comes down hard on the side that there are divine attributes. In fact, there's infinite divine attributes. However, they're not necessarily the attributes we would expect. So traditionally, I guess power and goodness and wisdom would be thought of as divine attributes. Maybe life is often on the list. In Spinoza, power is equal to divine essence. Right? This is proposition something or other, today's reading, that the divine power is the same as the divine essence. Right? That, again, is saying that everything follows from God by necessity, and the necessity is logical necessity. Everything follows from God by definition, by the definition of God, so to speak. Right? That's what it means to say that the power is the same as the divine essence. As far as goodness goes, according to Spinoza, that's not a real attribute of anything. Right? He explains in the appendix to part 1 that we come across the idea good because we imagine that everything in our blind cupidity and greed, we imagine that everything in the universe is there in order to be useful for us. And then we start classifying everything in terms of useful for us or not useful for us, as if that were an essential part of their nature. But in fact, it isn't. So in particular, it's certainly not right to say that God is good, according to Spinoza. Now, I mean, we'll see that there's a way to kind of take that back at the end of the book in a tricky way, and we'll see that when we get to it. But for now, he's saying, yeah, it doesn't make any sense to say that God is good. God didn't make things that are good so that we can enjoy them. God made absolutely everything conceivable because they follow from him by definition, whether we enjoy them or not. So perfection, everything in the universe has the highest possible perfection, but that doesn't mean goodness for us. That's not included in perfection. Perfection just means amount of reality. And remember, this is an issue that Descartes is kind of, it looks like there could be trouble for Descartes in this direction. Right? He assumes that part of being an absolutely perfect substance is being good, not lying to us, for example. So from Spinoza's point of view, that doesn't follow, at least not by that route at all. We'll see in what sense there is a God is not a deceiver argument of a kind in Spinoza, but we'll see what it is and where it goes. But it doesn't work by saying that God is really nice. Because that's just, it's not compatible with doing absolutely everything conceivable. Everything logically possible. And as far as knowledge goes, well, there is an intellect here. And that's the next thing we have to talk about. So there is a divine intellect. But rather than saying as many, although not all people, so for example, Neoplatonists want to say something similar to what Descartes says, namely that intellect is a restricted thing, and so it can't be the same as the divine essence. But a lot of people, including Descartes, wanted to say, no, God is, and actually, I mean, starting with Aristotle, this is basically Aristotle's definition of God, right? That God is infinite intellect. So Spinoza proves in basically that traditional Neoplatonist way that there is no attribute of intellect. Why? He says intellect is only one kind of thought. There's other kinds of thought, and Descartes has to agree with this. There's will and desire and imagination. Those are different kinds of thought. And so intellect is only one aspect of an attribute. Now, there's a kind of surprise waiting that I'm going to give away in part 2, which is the corollary of Proposition 49 of Part 2. This is on page 96, near the bottom. Will and intellect are one and the same thing. Right? So it turns out that this whole argument that we have in Part 1 about how intellect is only one mode of thought because intellect and will are distinct, that actually that's not Spinoza's real opinion. That's part of the plot. It's going to turn out that will and intellect are the same. And actually, as you go on in the book, it becomes harder and harder to see what other modes of thought are left except intellect. Why do will and intellect turn out to be the same? Well, it's roughly speaking because if you remember in Descartes, the main example of the distinction between will and intellect was judgment. Right? That the intellect contains the idea of something that's like a picture, Descartes says, whereas the will assents to or denies that picture. So it judges it to exist or not to exist. And then Descartes says, or also can seek or avoid it, right? Those are basically supposed to be aspects of the same faculty. But the important one was judgment. So in Spinoza, everything conceivable exists. Because everything conceivable, that is, as he puts it explicitly in Proposition 16, all the contents of infinite intellect are produced by God. So if there is a correct idea, its object exists. And that's why, and if you look at the proof of that corollary, proposition 49, you'll see that this is how he proves it. That's why simply having the idea of something, simply, so to speak, picturing it. But again, Spinoza is going to say that we think these things are different because we confuse ideas with pictures, basically. So simply, so to speak, picturing it, if it's accurate, is the same as judging it to exist. Now you may say something like, or you should say something like, wait, it always exists? And the answer is no, of course it only exists if it's a finite thing sometimes. But we haven't explained what that means yet. And in fact, it's not clear whether Spinoza has a good explanation of what that means or not. I think that Kant's main way into criticizing Spinoza is to claim that he's illegitimately assumed that we understand what time is, even though there really is no room for time in his system. All right, are there questions about this so far? I see some people are looking like maybe I should have taken a break after all. Those of you at home, and as if anyone's going to watch this video, in video land, take a break whenever you want. So are there questions about this? All right. Well, anyway, but so far as we know, intellect is just one kind of thought. And what kind of thought is it? Well, it's an important kind of thought. It's the kind of thought that the modes of which have objects. This is the same thing we saw in Descartes, right? So the contents of intellect are ideas. Ideas are things that represent an object. And that's why in Proposition 16, even though intellect is only one aspect of the attribute of thought, Spinoza says that what God produces is everything that can be conceived by intellect, right? Because intellect is the only part of thought that conceives things. So it means, and this is a picture that I sometimes draw, well, I'm not sure it's a good way to draw it or not, but this is the way I sometimes draw it. This is the divine essence. And here's the attribute of thought and the attribute of extension. Now, we don't know this yet. He hasn't made this clear yet, but these are the only attributes that we know specifically there are.
According to Descartes.
According to Spinoza. We can be sure there's infinite attributes, but these are the only two we know about. Whether that means, and therefore we know that there's lots more that we don't know about, or whether that means maybe in this context 2 is infinite, is actually a tough point in Spinoza interpretation.
What does the intersection say right there?
The intersection says essence. This is the divine essence, right? Every attribute completely expresses the divine essence.
That essence is the intersection between thought and extension?
This dot is the divine essence, but that's not the thing to concentrate on, right? The point is, the reason I draw them all intersecting there is because they all are expressions of the exact same thing in different ways, somehow. He doesn't exactly explain what those different ways, why there are different ways. I think he can say, well, we know there's at least 2 different ways because, well, it will turn out because basically because of our connection to these ways, because we are minds with bodies. But it's not clear whether he thinks we know or don't know whether there are other ways. And if so, how we know that or don't know that. We certainly, he's pretty clear that we don't know any specific other ways. So we don't know any other attributes. We can't name any other attributes except thought and extension. Yeah.
I thought it was something like that. Like there are infinite attributes, but the ones that we have access to for sure are thought and extension because of our constitution.
Right. The only ones we have access to are thought and extension. But the question is, should we say then, oh, but we can count the others, right? So we know that there's more than 2. So we know there's at least one other. You know, can we say that much about it or not? And that's not clear. In other words, again, the question is whether infinite attributes means really big, like a lot of them, or it just means we can't limit the attributes by number, or something like that. All right, anyway, so here's the picture. So there's thought and extension and perhaps other attributes we don't know about. But in thought, within the attribute of thought, is this part, the intellect. This is the divine intellect. And in the divine intellect are ideas of every possible thing, that is, every actual thing. Right? So in particular, every finite mode of extension has its finite mode corresponding idea in the divine intellect.
Wait, can you repeat that?
Every finite mode of extension, that is what we normally call bodies, right? Every finite mode of extension has a corresponding idea in the divine intellect. And if there's other attributes, every finite mode of them, and well, I mean, not just the finite modes, I'm concentrating on that, but infinite modes also, all of them have a corresponding idea in the divine intellect. And in fact, the divine intellect contains the idea of God, right? That's an example he keeps using in this. And whether it contains it or it's the same, that is the divine intellect, maybe, isn't it? It's not clear. It's one or the other. Maybe the idea of God in the attribute of thought just is the intellect.
Well, I mean, that goes back to his definition of substance where he says it's both exists in it and can be conceived through it. Right? I mean, isn't that exactly what you just said?
Exists in it and can be conceived through it. No, but see, that's true of every mode and every attribute. But this is the only mode that conceives God. So this is really special. Its special position is a little bit surprising, actually.
Well,
right? It says this attribute seems, even though all the attributes express the exact same thing, maybe that means both the attributes, but anyway, they express the exact same thing, namely the divine essence and its infinite power. This attribute of thought contains a special mode that bodies don't represent something other than themselves. That is, they don't represent anything. So there is no intellect in the attribute of extension. There's only an intellect in the attribute of thought. And that makes the attribute of thought look special in a way that we'll see is not only surprising, but perhaps problematic. That there's this asymmetry here that we don't expect. And this is one of the things that Leibniz is going to use to switch the system around, right? Leibniz is basically going to say, among other things, that the only true attribute of substances is thought. And thereby he's going to explain this asymmetry, which looks so surprising in Spinoza. In Descartes, it's not so surprising because in Descartes, there's kind of a hierarchy, even though he never says this very clearly. I think it's clear that thinking things are above extended things, right? So thinking things are active and represent, and the extended things, this is Descartes. The extended things are passive and they're represented. But in Spinoza, it looks like there should be a symmetry, and yet there isn't. Okay, so in this system, getting back to this issue here, there is not going to be a problem why God makes one thing rather than another thing, because God makes everything. At first sight, the problem of evil looks worse than ever, right? And not in the Job sense of why are things really bad, because we already addressed that, right? But in the philosophical version, how can a perfect being be because of something imperfect? Or how can an infinite being be because of something finite? This is also related to, I guess I didn't mention this controversy, but this controversy is related to this one somehow. Creation in time. Right? If God created the world at a certain time, then that seems to require one of these, at least, maybe requires this one. Right? How did God decide when to create it? He could have created it the instant before that, so to speak. So, was there a reason? How could the divine will do that? So, of course, for Spinoza, that issue doesn't come up with respect to the universe as a whole, but it does come up, and this is getting back to the question, right? When you say God makes everything possible, he doesn't make everything possible at every time. And again, that's just, if you try to deny that, if you try to argue and doubt, just by doing that, you're refuting yourself, right? That is, you're arguing, doubting, trying to convince yourself of something is already showing that not everything possible exists at every time. Is that clear why that is? I say, I don't know, but I want to know. That means I don't know now, but I might know later. And then if the question gets decided one way or the other, something has changed. So the reason, I said like vaguely these things are always connected somehow. In Spinoza, the connection seems to be pretty close. If you look at the two parts of the proof of Proposition 21, so Proposition 21 says, all things that follow from the absolute nature of any attribute of God must have existed always and as infinite. And then there's two parts of the proof. One where he proves it's infinite. He actually does it in the opposite order. And one where he says that, where he proves that it has to exist always. And they basically say the same thing. He basically says the same thing twice. Right? So that's the paragraph on page 47 and then the paragraph on page 48. Basically make the same argument twice, I think making it clear that somehow being finite and having a finite duration are supposed to be the same thing. Just as we already saw in the definition of eternal, that basically being infinite and being eternal are the same thing.
Does that mean he would dismiss the angels in the divine sphere? Being eternal but finite?
Well, no, he does get to those. He gets to those in Proposition 22. Right, so you're saying, wait, didn't I just contradict myself? Well, it's because, the reason I contradicted myself is because of the difference between absolute infinity and infinity in its kind. Right, which is also established in the definitions. Definition 2, a thing is said to be finite in its own kind when it can be limited by another thing of the same nature. So nothing is absolutely infinite except God. So in that sense, there can't be anything, even the attributes are not absolutely infinite, apparently, even though they express absolute infinity, whatever that means. But lots of things can be infinite in their kind. For example, the infinite intellect. Right? The infinite intellect is infinite in its kind. It's not limited by any other intellect, and therefore it's also eternal. And that's the kind of thing that fits in here, basically.
So it has the capacity to be limited, but it's not?
No, it's limited by other. It is limited. It's just it's limited because it's not the only kind of thing. It's not limited in its kind. So, I mean, whether that makes sense or not, that's the distinction that he draws in definition 2. It shouldn't be surprising that it's coming, right? So if we don't know, actually, as I pointed out, what else to put in the attribute of thought. At this point, we still think we can put will in there, let's say. So we would say, here's the infinite will and here's the infinite intellect. And they're different. They're each infinite because they're not limited by other things of the same kind. But they're each finite because they're not the only kind of thought. There's other kinds of thought. Right. So, but when we talk about finite modes, we mean modes that are not infinite in their own kind. For example, bodies. Right? So a body is a finite mode of extension. It's limited by other bodies. That's the example, in fact, that he gave in definition 2. And what I'm saying is that finite, in that sense, and having finite duration seem to be equivalent. Just as infinite in its kind and eternal seem to be equivalent. So again, that's why I'm saying the question of how, the problem of evil, the question, how can an infinite being create finite things, and the problem of creation in time, how can an eternal being create things of finite duration, things that start at a certain time and end at a certain time, seem to be basically equivalent for Spinoza. And in propositions 21 through 23, which 21 I was just reading is the first one of, it starts to look bad for this problem. It starts to look like we can't get to finite things. Right? So God is infinite and eternal, of course. And therefore, the attributes which express the divine essence are infinite and eternal. And therefore, and this is proposition 21, anything that follows from the nature of an attribute is infinite and eternal. So here he uses the example of the idea of God in thought. And like I said, it seems like maybe that's the same as the infinite intellect. Let's call that the idea of God. Now, I mean, it's true, he doesn't actually say in the proof that the idea of God in thought is something that follows from the attribute. If you read carefully, he just assumes it is, and then proves a contradiction if you then go ahead to claim it's finite, or a finite duration. Right? So in other words, he could have said, like, okay, assume this chair follows from the nature of the attribute of thought. And it's finite, or it has finite duration, I'm going to derive a contradiction. Which is a little worrying, but on the other hand, it seems like he thinks this is a good example, actually. In other words, the idea of God, which perhaps is the same as the infinite intellect, is actually something that follows from the nature of the attribute of thought. Right? So again, what that means is something like, the attribute of thought itself is just thought without further determination, and yet somehow it contains within itself all the ways thought can be determined. Right? They follow from the nature of thought. So they can't be conceived without thought. Even though thought can be conceived in itself without them, they can't be conceived without thought because their whole being is something that follows from thought. And intellect is one of those, let's say. So Proposition 21 proves that anything like that has to also be infinite in its kind and eternal. And then Proposition 22, whatever follows from some attribute of God insofar as the attribute is modified by a modification that exists necessarily and as infinite through that same attribute, must also exist both necessarily and as infinite. So he doesn't even give an example of this. But
Wait, so he's saying the modification itself is infinite?
right. And look, I mean, remember, so far, we only know how to get infinite, eternal things out of the attribute of thought. So it's not surprising that the modification is also infinite and eternal. And I guess the idea is supposed to be something like that it follows from the nature of thought that intellect has to be either this way or that way. I guess. I'm not, which way? I don't know. I said he doesn't give an example. And I'm not even sure that's right. It might be that somehow the modification is supposed to be another one of these things. So you'd say that the intellect as modified by will or something like that. But the point is, whatever we do here, every modification we're going to get, however it comes from the attribute of thought, is itself going to be infinite and eternal. And whatever we apply it to is going to be infinite and eternal. So it looks like we're only going to get infinite, eternal things out of this. And that's why I said the problem of evil looks worse than ever. I mean, as you might expect, right? You've said that the only thing that exists is an absolutely infinite substance. How are you going to get finite, imperfect things out of it?
Well, I mean, isn't it just that things appear finite and imperfect, but in actuality, when we understand them through God, they're not?
Well, yes and no. I mean, with respect to substance, they're not. In that sense, what you're saying is right. So, in other words, when you ask, what is it that's really here, and substance is supposed to be the answer to that question. Right? That's what the category of substance is about, basically, right? So you ask, what is this here? This is Socrates. It's a human. It's an animal. So for Spinoza, the answer is always God. So in that sense, it's true that things only appear finite. But no, I mean, God is infinite power and really does produce infinite attributes, and there really are infinite finite modes. They're just not substances. They can't be conceived for themselves, but that doesn't mean they don't exist.
Yeah. You say that if God truly is absolutely infinite, it would require that he has finite things, because finite things are things, and they would be in the spectrum of the infinite.
Yeah.
So if he wasn't finite, then he wouldn't truly be infinite.
Well, but part of the question, so therefore you can put the question to Spinoza in another way. How are finite things conceivable?
Well, they're picturable.
So he hasn't explained what a picture is at all yet, and it turns out that when he explains that, he's going to invoke the relationship of our idea to a finite body. So that would be circular, really. That is, the question is, how can the infinite intellect contain ideas of finite things? Right? Because you're saying, well, look, if God didn't create finite things, there'd be some things that there are ideas of in the infinite intellect that God couldn't create. And it's true. Spinoza would say that's absurd. But the question is, how can there be? And the line of thought I was just going through, I mean, as it has to be, because the necessity by which God creates things is logical necessity. right? So the line of thought I was just going to is basically a line of thought about definitions, right? It's saying like every modification, like differentia, so to speak, they're not really differentiate, but they're kind of like it, right? Every modification that I add here as I go, they're all infinite and eternal. So everything I can define this way is going to be infinite and eternal. How am I ever going to get to a definition of something that's finite in its kind? And if you can't ever get to a definition of it, starting from infinite intellect, then there is no idea of it, and there would be no problem with saying God doesn't create it. Except that, as a matter of fact, a posteriori, we find here we are, we're finite. Right? So that would be a big problem. But, yeah, so you couldn't object that way, or in other words, that just makes the problem, that just puts the problem another way. So the answer is, I don't know, it's clever and screwy, but it's important. The answer is basically, it comes in Proposition 28. Every individual thing, that is, anything whatever which is finite and has a determinate existence. So this is just his definition of individual here, right? Any individual thing, anything which is finite and has a determinate existence, cannot exist or be determined to act unless it be determined to exist or to act by another cause which is also finite and has a determinate existence. And this cause again cannot exist or be determined to act unless it be determined to exist and to act by another cause which is also finite and has determinate existence, and so ad infinitum.
What?
So the answer is this. In what way does the essence of God contain a finite mode? Insofar as the essence, as an attribute of God is modified by another finite mode.
Such as what?
Well, so for example, in what respect does the attribute of extension contain this chair?
Only insofar.
Well, it's only insofar as the attribute of extension contains some other finite mode, which is the cause of this chair. Well, okay, how does the attribute of extension contain that finite mode? Well, only insofar as it contains some other finite mode, which is the cause of that. And you say, wait, Spinoza, that's an infinite regress. And he says, yeah, that's an infinite regress. That is, it takes an infinite amount of definition, so to speak, to get to any finite mode. As I said, it's clever and screwy, right? And that's okay because this is an infinite intellect. Right? It contains infinitely complicated ideas. This same trick is going to be taken over by Leibniz and used for a slightly different purpose, but it's basically the same trick. The infinite intellect contains infinitely complicated ideas. So what seems impossible to us, that is defining an individual thing, starting from the most universal possible concepts, is not impossible for an infinite intellect. Okay, but what that also means is, so whether that works or not, it's hard to say. I don't even think, it's not something where modern mathematical logic could help you. This is still an issue, basically. Right? Does it make sense to have formal systems that include infinite proofs in them? It's still an issue. But in any case, that's the answer. And the consequence of that answer is this. My intellect, we haven't seen which one yet. We'll see coming up in part 2 what mode of thought my intellect is. But of course, it's some mode of thought, right? Everything is a mode of God. So if there's such thing as my intellect, it must be a mode somewhere in the divine attribute of thought. just as this chair has to be a mode of the divine attribute of extension. So somewhere in the infinite intellect is my intellect, but my intellect is finite. So my intellect can't contain that whole chain of infinite causes. I mean, whatever else it means to be a finite intellect, and again, we'll see more about that coming up, it's clear that a finite intellect doesn't contain infinite definitions like that, or infinite proofs. I mean, they're kind of the same thing, right? That's, if ideas and judgments are the same thing, then definitions and proofs are the same thing. Right? Because that is, when you define something, you prove that it exists. Because everything conceivable exists. Right? So my intellect doesn't contain those infinite proofs or infinite definitions, and therefore, what Spinoza says in the appendix, that human beings are born ignorant of the true causes of things, it's actually by definition that we're ignorant of the true causes of things. He doesn't go so far as to point that out there, but that's true according to his system. It will become clear in part 2. And that explains why, from our point of view, every individual thing is quote-unquote contingent. Right? So what does contingent mean? Because, after all, he's proved that everything is necessary, and he takes that up in the first scholium to Proposition 33. This is where that guy from Texas was like, I have shown more clearly than the sun at noonday. I was telling people before that I was listening to an audiobook of ethics in my car, and part of it was read by this guy from Texas. Right, so I have shown more clearly than the sun at noonday that there is absolutely nothing by virtue of which, that in things there is absolutely nothing by virtue of which they can be said to be contingent. And so now, he says, I wish to explain briefly what we should understand by contingent. And basically, reading a little bit farther down, but a thing is termed contingent for no other reason than the deficiency of our knowledge. For if we do not know whether the essence of a thing involves a contradiction, or if knowing full well that its essence does not involve a contradiction, we still cannot make any certain judgment as to its existence, because the chain of causes is hidden from us, then that thing cannot appear to us either as necessary or as impossible. So we term it either contingent or possible. And it should be clear now that every individual thing is going to be contingent in this sense. In fact, it's going to have both of those problems. We don't know if its essence involves a contradiction and the chain of causes is hidden from us, because those are the same thing. We don't have the definition of it. We don't have the definitions of any individual things. So when we try to think of them, we can't be sure that we're thinking of anything. And if so, we can't be sure on what condition we're thinking of it, and therefore we don't know what it follows from, and therefore we don't know when it exists.
So his answer to the epistemological question is that we really don't know shit.
Well, about individual things. We know about these things, because a finite intellect can understand the finite derivation of infinite things from the attribute of thought or extension. So, remember how there was that part in the first meditation where the meditator says, okay, well, maybe all the evidence of my senses is no good, but I can still rely on universal things like the truths of mathematics. So, and that turned out to be more or less right for Descartes. That is what we know. I mean, there's an argument how we can know that there are some bodies that affect that we have some finite body and there's some bodies around us. And it will turn out Spinoza agrees with that too. We just don't know, as Descartes would agree, we don't know their true essence. But we do know the universal truths about the essence of bodies, that is geometry. Because it will turn out that our finite intellect contains an adequate idea of extension, and from that, in a finite number of steps, we can infer things like the interior angles of a triangle, all add up to 180 degrees. Okay, I think we've now arrived at the end of the time that was scheduled for this. And I pretty much said what I needed to, so I guess I will see you guys next week. But remember, there will be a lecture as usual tomorrow night. I just won't be there. Okay. And the metaphysics exercises due dates have not been changed, so they're still due on Tuesday and Thursday, even though the class schedule has changed. Okay, see you later.
Blah, 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 blah.